Marcus watched as the little girl adjusted her grip on the teddy bear, the weight of her uncertainty heavy in the air. The courtroom seemed to grow quieter, the hum of whispers dying down as Amara's small footsteps echoed. He could feel the nervous energy radiating from her, the same way he could sense the slight tremor in her voice as she spoke. I want to live with my aunt, please." Her words, though barely above a whisper, were like a plea to something deeper in him. His usual detachment was slipping, and Marcus found himself leaning forward, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. It was rare for a case to stir anything within him, but something about this little girl, the way she clung to that old bear as if it was her only piece of stability, seemed to reach past his usual guard. "Amara," he began, his voice steady but soft, "tell me about your aunt." His eyes didn't leave hers as she hesitated, like the question itself was something she wasn't sure how to answer. With a deep breath, Amara spoke again, her voice shaky but carrying a quiet strength. She's the only one who never gave up on me. She writes me letters every week, and she says she wants me to come live with her. I know she loves me. I know she'll take care of me." The courtroom held its breath, the weight of her words hanging in the space between them. Marcus glanced at the advocate standing beside Amara, her eyes flickering with quiet support. He didn't need to ask if her aunt had been investigated. He already knew the answer. The system had done its checks and balances. But that didn't make this decision any easier. Amara's eyes widened as she looked up at him, holding his gaze, a mixture of hope and desperation on her face. "Please, Judge Fairness, I need to be with her. I can't keep moving around like this." Her small fingers clutched the teddy bear so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The room seemed to shift, and for a moment, it felt like Marcus was no longer in the courtroom, but back in the quiet of his office, the file before him, his thoughts turning over the weight of his responsibility. He cleared his throat, gathering his thoughts. "Amara, I hear you, and I can see how much this means to you." He paused for a moment, his heart catching at the quiet bravery she showed in her plea. "I need to consider what's best for you, and I'll make sure to do that." The words hung in the air, and Marcus felt a pang of guilt for the weight they carried. "What's best for her?" he repeated in his mind, the phrase echoing like a constant refrain. He glanced at the social worker, who nodded with a slight frown. It was clear she was just as torn as he was. Amara's aunt had a clean record, a steady job, and the necessary means to provide a stable home. But there were always complexities lurking beneath the surface that the paperwork never captured. "Amara," Marcus continued, his voice now softer, "I want you to understand that I take what you're asking very seriously. This decision is about ensuring that you have a place where you can feel safe and loved, a place where you can grow." Her eyes widened again, as if the weight of his words was just beginning to settle in. "I will be safe with her, I swear. I promise I'll do whatever it takes to make it work," she pleaded, her voice catching as she wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. The raw emotion in her plea was unmistakable. For a moment, the room felt smaller, quieter, as everyone watched her, this tiny girl who had been let down by the world more than anyone should. Safe, loved, growing. Marcus repeated those words in his mind as he looked around the courtroom, noting the expressions of those present. The foster advocate, the social worker, the attorney, everyone had a role to play, but only he could make the final call. "Amara," he said again, choosing his words carefully, "you've been through more than most people can imagine, and I can see how much you want this. But it's not just about wanting, it's about what is truly going to give you the chance to heal and find happiness. That's the responsibility I have to you, and to your future." Amara's small shoulders sagged, but she held her ground. Her eyes were defiant, despite the exhaustion etched into her face. "I can't keep waiting," she whispered, almost to herself. "I need to know that I'm loved, that I belong somewhere." There it was again, that pull in his chest. Marcus took a breath, eyes fixed on her trembling form. He knew she wasn't just asking for a new home. She was asking for a chance to believe that, despite everything, there were people in this world who saw her not as a case number, not as a file, but as a child who deserved to have a place to belong. The silence in the courtroom stretched. Everyone knew that whatever decision Marcus made would affect Amara's life in ways that were impossible to predict, and yet it felt like the weight of the moment had settled solely on his shoulders. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closing for a moment, processing everything. Then, with a steady voice, he spoke again. "We will adjourn for today. I will take everything you've said into consideration before making my decision." The tension in the room lifted, but it didn't fully disappear. Marcus knew the pressure was far from over. For now, though, the only thing he could give was time to think. Time to reflect on a decision that would shape this young girl's life. As Amara slowly turned to leave the stand, the teddy bear still clutched tightly to her chest. Marcus watched her, a new sense of determination in her step, and for the first time in a long while, he couldn't shake the feeling that the courtroom was no longer just a place where justice was served. It was a place where lives, fragile and raw, were being shaped. As the court adjourned, Marcus couldn't shake the image of Amara's hopeful, yet broken, face. He sat for a few moments in silence, his fingers tapping against the edge of his desk as he stared out the window. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting shadows across the room, but his mind was elsewhere. Caught in the pull of that small girl's plea, he was about to leave his office when the door creaked open, and his assistant, Clara, poked her head inside. Clara was a steady presence, always efficient and a bit of a skeptic, someone who could read people with the precision of a trained psychologist. She'd been working with him for years, and he trusted her instincts. "Judge Fairness," she said softly, stepping inside. "I know you're likely swamped with cases, but there's someone here to see you. Someone who thinks she has information on Amara's aunt." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Information? You mean regarding her fitness as a guardian?" Clara nodded. She didn't give many details, just insisted she needed to talk to you personally. She seemed urgent. "Should I let her in?" Marcus glanced at the clock. He could still give Amara's case some time to settle in his mind before making any decisions. "Go ahead, Clara. Send her in." A few moments later, a woman walked in, her heels clicking with an almost rhythmic certainty on the hardwood floor. She was in her early 30s, her brown hair pulled into a tight bun, and a sharp business suit that suggested she was someone accustomed to being in control. Her eyes were dark and calculating, but there was an underlying tension in her posture, like someone carrying the weight of a secret they weren't sure they were ready to reveal. "Judge Fairness," she said, her voice steady but with an edge that hinted at urgency. "My name is Victoria Daniels. I'm an investigator with the Department of Social Services." She extended her hand, her gaze unwavering. Marcus stood, shaking her hand, but he didn't hide the curiosity in his eyes. "What can I do for you, Miss Daniels?" Victoria wasted no time. "I've been following up on Amara Johnson's case, and there's something you need to know about her, and something that hasn't been brought to your attention yet." Marcus felt a flicker of unease. "What are you suggesting?" Victoria hesitated, then pulled a file from her bag and placed it on Marcus's desk. "I've uncovered some inconsistencies in the background. Check they conducted on Amara's aunt. At first glance, she appears to be an ideal candidate. Good job, stable living conditions, all the boxes ticked, but..." She paused, her gaze lingering on the file in front of him. "There are financial irregularities in her past, and she's been linked to an underground network of foster home placements, places where children are placed for financial gain, not necessarily with the right people." Marcus leaned forward, his heart racing as he scanned the file. The evidence was thin, but enough to make him pause. "Are you saying her aunt is involved in trafficking children?" "No," Victoria replied quickly, "not trafficking. But there's a shadow network operating right under the surface, and I think her aunt may be more involved than she's letting on. I'm still digging, but I think you should hold off on making a decision until we know more." Marcus set the file down, his brow furrowed. He couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. It was rare for a case to feel so layered, so full of potential danger. He'd seen plenty of difficult cases before, but this felt different. Before he could respond, Clara knocked softly at the door again, entering with a tall, older man in tow. His face was worn, his body hunched as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. He had a gruff, no-nonsense demeanor, and the dark circles under his eyes suggested sleepless nights. "Judge," Clara said, her voice filled with something between curiosity and caution. "This is Detective Raymond Holt. He's been following some of the same leads Victoria mentioned. He wanted to speak with you." Marcus stood again, extending his hand. "Detective Holt, I assume you have something to add?" Holt nodded, his voice low and measured. "We've been investigating a number of cases tied to the foster care system in this city, Judge. there's been talk of a syndicate. People moving kids around for less than legal reasons. We've heard rumors, but until recently, there was no concrete evidence. That is, until we found a connection between Amara's aunt and a few known figures in the network. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He knew what this meant. If Amara's aunt was involved in something shady, it would change everything. The decision he'd been so carefully weighing was no longer just about giving a child a loving home. It was about keeping her safe from a world that had failed her too many times. So, you're saying her aunt is directly involved? Marcus asked, his voice tight. Not directly, Holt said, but she's in the periphery, and I believe she might be trying to cover her tracks. We've got a few leads, but we need time to gather more information. I'd recommend postponing any guardianship decisions until we can dig deeper. Victoria gave a small nod of agreement. We can't risk putting Amara in a potentially dangerous environment. Judge, not when there's so much uncertainty about her aunt's connections. Marcus sat back, his mind spinning. Just when he thought he had a clear path ahead, it had all become a tangled mess. There were too many moving pieces, too many potential dangers lurking in the shadows. All right, he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in his head. I'll delay the decision, but I need all of you to stay on top of this. We're dealing with a child's life, and I'm not going to let her become a pawn in a game I don't fully understand. As the group filed out, leaving him to ponder what he had just learned, Marcus found himself staring at the file in front of him again. What had they missed? What was Amara's aunt hiding? Marcus sat alone in his office, the weight of the case pressing heavily on his chest. The words of Detective Holt and Victoria Daniels echoed in his mind, but Amara's tear-streaked face haunted him more. The complexity of the case had only grown deeper, and now, more than ever, he felt the responsibility of making the right choice, one that wouldn't just affect Amara's future but would also ripple out and affect the people connected to her. As the afternoon slipped into evening, Marcus carefully re-examined the file before him. Amara's plea for a better life, her hope for something stable and secure, felt almost like a whisper in the storm that was swirling around her. He had no way of knowing what would happen next, but one thing was certain. He couldn't let her be another casualty of a broken system. The following day, the courtroom was again filled with the hum of waiting voices, the tension thick. When Marcus entered, he didn't feel the usual detachment that had served him so well over the years. Today, he felt deeply connected to every life in this room. Amara, he called, his voice strong yet gentle. She looked up, eyes filled with a mixture of dread and hope. I've had time to consider your case, and while there are still unanswered questions about your aunt, I believe that you deserve a chance to feel safe and loved. That is what this court should stand for, what every child deserves. The courtroom went quiet as Marcus continued. I am ordering that the guardianship hearing be continued, but with heightened scrutiny. There will be an investigation into your aunt's background, and in the meantime, you will remain in the care of your current foster family. This decision is not final, but we will not rush it. I will make sure that, no matter what, your safety and well-being come first. Amara's face brightened slightly, though she still clung to the teddy bear with her usual tight grip. But for the first time, there was a glimmer of peace in her eyes. She wasn't being abandoned. She wasn't being forgotten. Marcus turned to the others in the room. This case will be revisited when we have more information. Until then, I trust that every party involved will work to protect Amara's best interests. As the room filed out, Marcus caught sight of Clara in the hallway. She gave him a small nod of approval, but it was Victoria and Detective Holt who lingered, their faces still set with the weight of the investigation ahead. You've made the right choice, Judge, Holt said, his gruff voice softer now. We'll follow up, and we'll find the truth, no matter where it leads. Victoria smiled faintly. This isn't over, but we'll make sure Amara gets the life she deserves. Marcus watched them leave and felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. The decision he'd made wasn't the end, but it was a step in the right direction. It was a decision made with the child in mind, not the politics, not the logistics. What's best for her, he had to keep reminding himself of that. Later that night, Marcus sat by his own desk at home, reading over case files and reflecting on the past few days. He thought about the many children like Amara who were caught in a system that wasn't perfect, but at least there were moments like today where people could still make a difference. And though he couldn't predict the future, Marcus knew one thing: he would always fight for the children who needed it most, even when the road ahead seemed unclear. Moral or lesson: the story highlights the importance of integrity and compassion in decision-making. No matter how difficult the circumstances or how complex the case, the right choice often requires us to look beyond the surface and prioritize the well-being of others, especially when they are vulnerable. It teaches us that systems, no matter how well-intentioned, are not infallible, and it is our duty to ensure that every individual, particularly children, receive the care, safety, and love they deserve. When making decisions that affect others, especially the most vulnerable, it's vital to always consider what's best for them.